want to thank you for attending our 8th annual presentation of the President's Fellows findings. This year, they studied the role that the University of Maryland, Baltimore can play in addressing gun violence through education, research, clinical care, and service. The students really have done an excellent job. Thank you for all of your work, and thank you for all those who supported you in doing this work. Really, we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't due to the support of Dr. Perman and all of the trust and confidence that he has in our students to create meaningful change here on campus and beyond. So I want to welcome Dr. Perman.
Thanks, Patty. Thank you all for coming out today. I guess it was the Parkland shooting a year ago, February. I think I have that. I remember that one of the things that I called for was some input from the campus community as to what the role of UMB should be in gun violence. And again, and this is not meant to be patronizing for the students and other students in the audience, I do have a firmly held belief that most of the good ideas around here come from the students. I've learned that over many years in academia, the importance of listening to the students. So that's what we did with the President's Fellows for this academic year. For probably the past half dozen years, we've had a President's Fellows program and asked our students, representative of the schools at UMB, to look at a problem and tell us where we belong in it and what we need to bring to the problem. So we kicked off this year's President's Fellows White Paper Project on September 6th, 2018, 7 months ago. And since then, 168 people in Baltimore City have been shot to death. I know most of us feel powerless when we see a shooting in a school or we see the carnage that I just mentioned right outside our walls. But these folks, they don't act powerless. And they've decided to take on the politics and the systems and the societal inaction that has gotten us to this bad place. And interestingly, because I've had a chance to talk with them, probably last about a month ago in my office, they decided to examine gun violence not only as a matter of health, but health equity. They looked at all those things that sow division in our community: fear, anger, injustice, and explored how those conditions in turn give rise to the violence that we are trying to combat. And then they turned the lens inward to tell us what our institution could and should be doing in our own community to mitigate gun violence and to care for those affected by it. So students, precious students, I thank you for a year of very hard work. It's a topic that is emotional and draining in itself, but I know that in what you're going to report out to us, we'll all be the better for it. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Before I begin, I want to give you a small disclaimer. I recently had double jaw surgery, so if my speech is not as clear, please forgive me, and the dental professionals in the room can explain to you what that all entails. But I have the privilege of welcoming you all to the 2018-2019 President's Fellow Findings presentation. This year, we had the task of examining gun violence and UMB's role as an anchor institution in addressing gun violence. So thank you all for coming out. My name is Lauren Highsmith, and I am a graduating Master of Social Work student. I am a Baltimore native, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to be a part of this project. Last August, a 7-year-old girl was killed in West Baltimore while she was sitting in a car. And a lot of times when gun violence is examined, it's examined from the mass shooting perspective. And although that's equally as important and tragic, I feel like it's also important that we focus on what's going on in our own backyard.
Hi, everybody. My name is Zachary Lee. I'm a second-year law student at Cary Law right down the street. My pronouns are he, his, and him. I originally wanted to get involved in this project because I was born and raised in Parkland, Florida. I graduated from Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in 2013, my sister 2 years later in 2015. After what had happened at Valentine's Day 2 years ago, I saw a handful of children from my hometown become the national leaders and sort of guide the conversation on what gun violence looks like in this country. And I was very inspired by them generally. So I spoke at a March for Our Lives event, and at the end, when the catharsis kind of wore down, I said that this really can't be the end of the conversation, so decided to take on this task.
My name is Jessica Ian. I am in my second of 4 years in the Adult Gerontology Primary Care DNP program. I go by she and her. I've also been a nurse in the city for several years, and through that, I've witnessed a lot of unavoidable suffering, and I find gun violence particularly upsetting because it brings about a lot of pain and suffering that I feel should be avoidable. And so I joined this project to try to put steps in place to make sure that we are actively avoiding gun violence and the suffering that comes along with it.
Hi, I'm Jenny Afkinich. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in social work, and my preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. My social work practice experience and my current research interests are primarily around juvenile justice and how bias leads to racial disproportionality in our justice systems. And I was hoping to take this opportunity to consider the topic of gun violence through the lens of racial disproportionality.
Hi, my name is Vibha Rao. I'm a graduate of the University of Maryland School of Medicine. I graduated in 2018, and currently I'm pursuing a master's in clinical research here at the University of Maryland Baltimore Graduate School. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I decided to pursue this fellowship because I've spent the last 10 years, a greater part of my adulthood in Baltimore City, and I've been heavily involved in the community for the last 10 years, working with a lot of young people in the area. And it's devastating for me to see the social and economic inequities, not just in the way that they are raised, but the health outcomes that they are affected by that, we can play a role in diminishing. And that's something that I hold very near and dear to my heart. And I think that violence, like Jess was saying, is something that is absolutely avoidable and something that we as UMB, as a community, can help combat, which is why I wanted to be a part of this.
My name is Nicole Campion Diallo. I'm in the dual degree program in the School of Medicine pursuing MD and a Master's of Public Health. My pronouns are she and hers. So I wanted to get involved in this project because I've lived now in the Hollins Market neighborhood, just half a mile west of our campus, for about 5 years. And just from my experiences there, I feel like I have a bit of a sense of the sort of the experience that we have as just living in a neighborhood where violence is happening, and how that has made me feel. And I was interested in learning more about how that makes everybody feel, and the connections between sort of experiencing trauma in the community and then health outcomes from there.
Now, before we begin, I just wanted to recognize the Piscataway Nation land on which UMB sits today. And I'd like to read an excerpt that James from the Writing Center has provided for us. We humbly make this land acknowledgement. We gather here today on Turtle Island, the indigenous term for the North American continent. We would like to recognize the indigenous people of this land, the Piscataway, an Algonquin people. We have come together here today on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. The word Chesapeake is also an Algonquin word named after a nation of people who once lived near the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, in an area now called Hampton Roads, Virginia. While a land acknowledgement is simply not enough, it is an important social justice and decolonial practice that promotes indigenous visibility and a reminder that we are on a sacred land. Let this land acknowledgement be an opening for all of us to contemplate a way to consider the centuries of struggles to resist colonial indoctrination through various indigenous movements for identity, sovereignty, and self-determination.
We would like to acknowledge the great residents of Baltimore City for their many contributions, not only for their assistance in the development of this white paper, but also for the wealth of knowledge and experience they continuously provide for us as budding community advocates, professionals, clinicians, and practitioners.
Thank you. So a brief little overview of our conversation today. These are some of the topics we're going to be discussing. They follow, I see some of you have picked up our white paper. They follow in order the information that's presented in the paper. So I hope you'll follow along as we actually go through the conversation. A brief minute to talk about our values. We understand that gun violence doesn't really happen in a vacuum. It's not unique to any race, class, gender, or socioeconomic status. There's a really intersectional nature to gun violence that we have to acknowledge. We approach this topic through an interprofessional lens. As you saw on the previous slide, we all have a very diverse academic background at this table, so we tried to really use that in terms of tackling the issue. We bring these varying perspectives, and we also sought out the varying perspectives of everybody on campus, whether it be students, faculty, and staff, but also leaders of the community and members of the community themselves. And we also wanted to make a strong emphasis on narrowing the focus of gun violence. Gun violence is a massive and pervasive issue, and it ranges in conversation not only from these mass casualty events, but also to street violence generally. Our charge specifically was to address gun violence in Baltimore, so we did narrow our focus on that precisely. That being said, some of our recommendations do draw with pretty broad strokes, and they operate on a very long-term basis. So just things to keep in mind as we move forward. Collective efficacy is a sociological term we encountered not only in academic literature, but also in our research and in our conversations with people. That being said, it is essential to our recommendations, and it's something, again, I hope you will keep in mind as we continue this conversation. It is a term used by sociologists referring to the ability of members of a community to control the behaviors of individuals and the groups in that community. Now, control doesn't necessarily mean something daunting in this context. It more refers to creating a safe, warm, and welcoming environment where trust, solidarity, and camaraderie really thrive in a community. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Jess, who's going to talk briefly about our objectives of the paper.
One of our primary objectives of the paper is to draw attention to the fact that gun violence is a multidisciplinary issue. It's also a very politically and emotionally charged topic, and because of that, it's easy to fall into the trap of placing all the blame on one cause, depending on what your beliefs are. But we believe the only way to make a difference is to acknowledge the range of contributing factors and to collaborate and work together to attack this issue from multiple angles. We also think that it's important and absolutely necessary. To make meaningful change to participate in critical self-reflection. And when we talk about critical self-reflection, we're referring to it on both an individual and institutional level. It's important to apply these questions to our actions and decisions in the future, but also to reflect on our actions and decisions of the past. For example, to consider if it's possible that there have been opportunities to intervene or act on gun violence or some of its contributing factors that maybe we haven't participated in or that we've shied away from. If we find this to be true, how can we use this information to influence our decisions and actions moving forward? As you'll hear throughout our presentation, we've spent a lot of time thinking about and discussing our relationships with Baltimore City and its residents. Going along with the topic of self-reflection, we believe it's important to keep in mind that it's possible for well-meaning interactions or interventions to unintentionally weaken collective efficacy and to potentially worsen gun violence or some of the factors that contribute to it if these interventions or interactions are not thought through thoroughly, or if they're not approached with the appropriate lens. And so we feel that in terms of community engagement, it's important that we keep in mind and through our actions, we make it clear that we view our neighbors in the city as equal partners in these efforts. Possibly our most important objective in this project is to remind everyone that we need to take action now. Collectively, we need to decide that the nearly 40,000 lives lost to guns in 2017 is unacceptable. We can't put off this problem until later. We can't throw up our arms and say that our politicians need to find a solution. We have a responsibility to take a deep dive into this issue and to identify ways that we can start taking action to help right now. In terms of our approach to this project, the 6 of us have worked together throughout the academic year. Our primary sources of information were peer-reviewed literature and semi-structured interviews, as well as the President's Symposium presentations that many of you attended. We completed 32 semi-structured interviews. We obtained a large amount of information. Together, we broke down and identified similarities and differences within this information and identified concepts that we use as the basis to develop our paper, this presentation, and the recommendations that we'll share with you throughout this presentation. And now Jenny's going to discuss some background.
Firearms have been used in the majority of homicides each year in the United States, but suicides account for the largest percentage of deaths in the U.S. that are associated with firearms every year. And that's been true every year here since 1999. This fact was highlighted by at least 2 of the symposium speakers that spoke with us this year, that firearms are not actually the primary means by which people attempt suicide, but because firearms are more lethal than other mechanisms, they account for the largest share of actual suicide deaths. Throughout the speaker series and our study of the literature, we were reminded time and again that the U.S. has a serious gun problem. Globally, civilians own an estimated 650 million guns. As you can see on the slide, American civilians own 357 million of the 650 million guns owned worldwide. That means that Americans own 48% of the civilian-owned guns in the world, although we only account for less than 5% of the global population. Although this issue is a national problem, Baltimore City holds a disproportionate amount of that burden. According to the Centers for Disease Control, the rate of deaths associated with gun violence in Baltimore is 3 times that of the national rate. Nearly 1/3 of the gun violence victims in the state of Maryland are young black men in Baltimore City specifically. The Baltimore Sun keeps an updated count of the number of gun violence victims in the city, which has remained very high in recent years. You can see the numbers here for 2017 and 18. Although gun-related deaths in predominantly low-income urban communities are often painted as an inner-city problem, approximately 10% of the gun-related homicides included in these statistics are victims who were not actually residents of Baltimore City. Claims that gun violence is isolated to only low-income neighborhoods are misleading. Gun violence is not simply a problem faced by other groups of people. It is pervasive and can affect all of us. To learn.
During our research, we heard a number of stories from those who have been affected by gun violence, one of which was by Ms. Sharon McMahon, who is the founder of A Mother Love Never Dies. Ms. Sharon's son's life was taken due to gun violence. Gun violence does not just affect the person at the other end of the barrel. It affects the family members, friends, and the whole community. The images you see on the screen were taken by local photographer Amy Burbert, who in 2016 returned to the scene of the crime on the exact day at the exact time to commemorate the life that was taken there exactly 1 year ago. We would also like to commemorate those who have been affected by gun violence by having a brief moment of silence. Thank you.
Gun violence in Baltimore City emerges from a multitude of dynamic social and economic factors. Unfortunately, the high rates of crime here in Baltimore City parallels the high rates of poverty, poor educational environment, food insecurity, and mortality. According to the 2017 Baltimore City Department of Health Health Assessment, 23.8% of individuals in the city live below the poverty line. 13% of the city is in a food desert, which is qualified as an area where the distance to a supermarket is greater than a quarter of a mile. 47.2% of Baltimore City residents, 25 years or older, have a high school degree or less, compared to the mere 28.7% who have a college degree or more. The homicide rate here in Baltimore City is 5.2 persons per 10,000 in 2017, and the youth mortality is at a staggering 31.2 persons per 10,000 individuals. We'd like to highlight the redlining map that's also shown in your specific white paper booklet. Individuals subject to an intergenerational cycle of violence, poverty, housing, and food instability, as well as systemic oppression, often suffer physical, mental, and emotional distress, including post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression, as well as aggressive behavior. Evidence has shown that even without these stressors physically present, children may suffer elevated stress levels and down the line perpetrate violence. Those who grow up surrounded by these inequities also have high rates of incarceration. According to those who responded to the Baltimore Community Health Survey, which I presented on the previous slide, 16% of those individuals reported that they had been incarcerated in the past. However, it is not coincidental all of these issues are not coincidental. Racial segregation within Baltimore City contributes to the socioeconomic conditions we see today that correlate with gun violence. Historical policies institutionalize the racial and ethnic divide here in Baltimore City that still separates African American and Caucasian communities today. For example, the Baltimore City Council's West Ordinance, which was passed in 1910, prohibited African Americans from moving into majority Caucasian neighborhoods and vice versa. This ordinance alone played such an instrumental role in the current racial divide seen here in Baltimore City. Furthermore, in the 1930s, the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation enacted mortgage market risk appraisals for neighborhoods in U.S. cities with a population greater than 40,000. This practice served as the basis for redlining, and in Baltimore City, labeled predominantly African American residential areas as high risk, preventing residents in these areas from buying homes and building wealth from their assets. Today, residents living here in these primarily minority, low-income neighborhoods experience the constant threats to their health and safety because of the social, economic, and environmental inequities that were institutionalized by these racial ordinances and policies. As displayed on the map above, gun-related homicides in Baltimore during 2018 clustered around the neighborhoods that were registered as third grade or fourth grade, indicating that they're high risk on a residential security map created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s. By race, Baltimore City is 62.8% Black or African American and 30.3% white. The persistence of the racial divide only exacerbates the socioeconomic inequities and further drives the issue of violent crime and gun violence. As Dr. Shaya, Director of the Social Work Community Outreach Service and a faculty member whom we interviewed, writes in her paper, Sharp, a framework for addressing the context of poverty and oppression during service provision in the U.S., this racial divide exacerbates the imbalance of resources, leading to overcrowding in areas that were designated high risk and also happen to be predominantly minority, and higher crime rates within and between the communities.
So Vibha mentioned already some of the mental health outcomes that we see associated with gun violence in some of our communities here in Baltimore. She highlighted that social determinants of health, all the ones that she just discussed, are associated with increased rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. So now that we've shared with you some background statistics and the historical context for gun violence as it exists in Baltimore, We hope you're starting to see how these systemic policies and practices have contributed to gun violence in the past and are still contributing to it today. It's all very complex, clearly, and there isn't one single cause or one single solution that jumps out at us when we look at all of these factors together. So for the 6 of us, when we were thinking about all of these things over the course of the year, our minds would sort of spin with, wow, this is just so complicated. So what we did was, as we were pulling themes out of all the interviews and research that we read, we tried to put them into a visual, and that's what I'm going to walk us through now. Okay, so this is our concept map. The first part here on the left shows how we understand the current situation to be. So I first want to draw your attention to the little yellow circle. We've mentioned these already, but the 2 big themes that emerged from all of our interviews were the concepts of power and relationships. Again, we'd like to acknowledge Dr. Wendy Shaya from the School of Social Work. She was really instrumental in helping us think about especially the concept of power as we were learning about violence. And really that UMB, when we think about it, has a lot of power in our neighborhood here in Baltimore. And when we talk about relationships, we're thinking about 3 different kinds of relationships. Those among people who are part of UMB, relationships among people and neighbors who live in our neighborhood, and then also the relationship between UMB and our neighbors. So now take a look at the red circle. Here we want you to note that UMB is not separate from, but rather embedded in a community. And that's why the little UMB is inside a bigger circle. And that bigger circle is representing our larger West Baltimore community. As Viva just mentioned, this community is facing many social and economic challenges, and we've listed some of them here on the concept map. Our campus and our neighborhood are continuously shaping each other. And when we thought about it, we realized that this shaping is kind of disproportionately in favor of UMB. And that's why the UMB is surrounded by a dashed line instead of a solid line. It shows that there's kind of a semi-permeable barrier between our campus and the community. Our campus is accessible to some people, but not to everybody who lives in and around UMB. And then in the small circle here in the middle around UMB, we've listed a few characteristics we identified that are contributing, we think, to this imbalanced power dynamic. We're going to talk more about some of them later, but I just want to mention now the fear that Dr. Perman brought up earlier, that there's danger sort of out there. We encountered that in a few interviews, and we think this is kind of an us versus them way of thinking. We just wanted to highlight that. And there's also, in some parts of our campus, maybe a bit of complacency or numbness towards this problem because it has been going on for so long, and some of us feel that, yes, this is a terrible problem, but I don't know what I can really do about it. So now the second part of our concept map is displaying what we think UMB should do to address these issues of power and relationships. The words in the red circle are the categories that we've grouped our recommendations into. And as we tell you about all of our recommendations, we'd like you to think about them through the lens of relationship building. As an anchor institution, UMB has a responsibility to work on building strong, mutually beneficial relationships in the 3 dimensions that I mentioned before, within our campus, between our campus and our community, and among members of our neighborhood community. And all of these things that we would like UMB to do have the goal of building collective efficacy, which Zach was explaining earlier. This collective efficacy will be built both on our campus and around our campus. And when we do this, we'll be better equipped to work together, both with each other here at UMB and with our neighbors outside of our walls. So now we're going to move into the second half of our presentation and tell you about the recommendations we've made. We'll describe each of these categories a little bit more. We'll tell you about the great things that UMB is already doing in some of these categories, and then areas that we think UMB can improve in. So our first category for recommendations is called campus climate. Now we know this term is kind of a hot topic right now, and it means different things to different people. But when we talk about campus climate, we're talking about broad ideas that relate to the way our campus operates and how people feel as a part of UMB. So in this sense, we're asking UMB leaders to take an introspective look at our relationships and power within and around our campus as they relate to gun violence. So that being said, our first recommendation pertaining to campus climate is to conduct a campus-wide scan of everyone who is affiliated with UMB to see how people are personally and professionally really affected by gun violence. In our interviews, we heard from a number of people who had direct personal or professional experience with gun violence. And so we think that the number of people who have these experiences on our campus could be quite large. And this warrants a closer look at how individuals on our campus are really impacted by these experiences. So for example, one person we talked with had lost a family member to gun violence, and she told us that the employee assistance program here on campus was very helpful to her. But when she came back to work, she got the sense that other people sort of expected her to be a support system for others who had had similar experiences, and this expectation became burdensome for her, and she didn't feel that it was she was really able to do that. So we think that maybe after doing a scan to really get a sense of what people are experiencing here, there may be more resources that our campus could offer. For example, an affinity group, which is something that exists related to other issues on our campus. But we think it could be something that might be helpful. All right. The next topic we want to share about campus climate is about the physical presence of our campus in the neighborhood where it is embedded. So to explain this concept, we're going to use an example of the large construction site that is across the street, across MLK on West Baltimore Street. It's across from the Community Engagement Center. You can see a picture of it here, and it looks like a hole in the ground, and it's surrounded by chain link fence. I know it's been there for at least 5 years, and that this property belongs to UMB. We're not really sure how long it has actually been like this. So if you look at this block from another angle, going towards our campus on Baltimore Street, you can see that the construction site has consumed the sidewalk on the southern side of the street. And folks who commute to our campus come and park their cars along this block as well, because it's free parking. But if you're a pedestrian who walks down this block every day from your neighborhood, right here in Hollins Market, towards our campus, when you get to this intersection, you have two choices. You can either cross the street to walk on the sidewalk that's still there, or because that may be inconvenient for you, you can just walk in the street next to the cars. So what do you think most people tend to do? Yeah, we walk in the street. So you might say, what does this have to do with gun violence? Well, what we would ask you to think about is that every time a person accepts to either cross the street or to put themselves in danger by walking in the street, they're reminded that they don't really have power over their own body moving through this physical space. And the power in this space is held by our university. So the message that you receive as somebody who's just passing through is that you're not in control of your space. And you feel like you're on the outside. So since we actually talked about this with a few people during the course of our project, and we know that leadership is working to try to improve the situation, and we're grateful for that. And we also know that nobody at UMB is intending to send a message like this to folks in our community, but it happens nonetheless. So we hope going forward our leaders at UMB can think very proactively about how we use the space that we physically occupy here in our neighborhood, and to think about it from the perspective of how it shows our power and how it either helps or hurts the relationships that we have with our neighbors. So I'm going to hand it over now to Jenny to talk about silos.
The last component of campus climate that was reiterated throughout our interviews was the notion that faculty and staff across schools and even departments within schools work in isolation from one another. So we have a couple of recommendations that we think could help to improve this issue. First, we recommend that UMB administration consider supporting a cluster hire of new faculty campus-wide. Cluster hiring is generally when multiple faculty are hired at the same time across departments, but who share a common research interest. And they then have the ability to collaborate with one another to tackle that interest. We suggest UMB would benefit from hiring faculty in several different schools who focus on gun violence research. And here we're thinking the faculty might study correlates, causes of gun violence, and also community-engaged interventions to combat gun violence. According to Higher Ed magazine, cluster hiring can promote and increase diversity among faculty as well. So that's just an additional benefit that we would see. We also believe supporting the new faculty in their efforts to collaborate with one another is important. And some suggestions that were noted by Inside Higher Ed include providing a shared workspace for the faculty to collaborate with one another, and also reserving time for an annual symposium where they could discuss the findings, for example. We're also concerned that the current safety talk that is provided to incoming students during orientation by the UMB police comes from a bit of a deficit perspective. We suggest that this is an opportunity for the UMB police to collaborate with experts here on campus to coordinate and redesign that safety talk to come from a more strength perspective. We also see the orientation itself as an opportunity to break down silos between students from different schools. Orientation could include a campus-wide component, which could serve as an introduction to Baltimore for incoming students. Other topics in this campus-wide orientation could include the history of the city, as well as an introduction to the concept of trauma-informed care, which Jess will explain.
So our next grouping of recommendations we categorize as capacity building. And by capacity building, we mean the way that we learn and teach within the institution. So we'd first like to discuss potentially incorporating trauma-informed care into curricula throughout the institution. The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality define trauma-informed care as an approach to engaging people with histories of trauma that recognizes the presence of trauma symptoms and acknowledges the role trauma has played in their lives. We are lucky at UMB to draw students with a variety of experiences from across the country. While we celebrate the range of backgrounds this brings into the institution, we also need to recognize that many students have not spent any time in Baltimore City when they arrive on campus, and potentially may not have spent much time in an urban environment in general. Because of this, we think it's important to offer students education and context for the trauma that some community members have experienced and continue to experience throughout their lives. We think this context is particularly important to share with students before we ask them to engage with residents on both a professional and clinical level. Trauma-informed care is a dense and complicated concept. It's difficult to completely grasp at one time, so we think it's important to initially introduce this concept to students during orientation when they first arrive on campus, and then to continue to reinforce and expand on this concept throughout their educational careers at UMB. Throughout the year, we also learned of a new class called the Policing Inside Out class. It was developed by Dr. Bahia Muhammad from Howard University and was launched on their campus in 2016. It's a 15-week course that involves students, faculty, community members, and law enforcement. Throughout the course, they participate in exercises where they share personal experiences and work together to investigate social justice issues and the concept of community policing. We were informed by Dr. Natasha Pratt-Harris, who is a faculty member at Morgan State University and was one of our President's Symposium speakers in November, that this class was expanded to Baltimore City this past fall through a collaboration between Morgan State University and Coppin State University. And from what we've heard, it was wildly successful. We corresponded with Dr. Muhammad, the creator of the class, as well as Dr. Pratt-Harris and Dr. Jacqueline Roden-Trader from Coppin State University, who brought the course to Baltimore City. And they all voiced their support for expanding this course to UMB, and we hope that we could achieve this goal in the future. In order to incorporate these concepts into curricula throughout the school, it's important to create structures to educate faculty on these concepts. We think an important place to start is offering faculty tools to recognize their own implicit biases. We know that we all have our own implicit biases, and the only way to work through them is to identify and acknowledge them. One particularly promising tool we've learned about to recognize implicit biases is the People's Institute Undoing Racism, and we hope that we could offer this training to all faculty at UMB. We'd also like to ask the institution to examine relationships between faculty's service-based or violence prevention work and their opportunities for tenure and promotion. This recommendation is not intended to create additional work for faculty, but rather to highlight and recognize the important and inspiring work that many faculty are completing in the community at this point in time. We believe the institution should send a message that it prioritizes such work. We also think that this examination would be particularly timely as the institution prepares its application for the Carnegie Community Engagement classification. We'd also like to ask the institution to consider creating a structure that compensates faculty for their time spent completing community groundwork research. Through our interviews, we've heard on a number of occasions that community members sometimes feel used by the institution for research. We think that creating a structure that allows for and encourages groundwork in the community could both strengthen relationships between faculty and residents and also help us identify the issues that are most pressing and concerning to community members, and therefore target these particular issues in our community-based research. We also learned of a faculty fellows program that existed at UMB a few years ago. This program was intended for junior faculties. It taught them about community engagement techniques and also, importantly, how to incorporate this content into curricula. We think reigniting this program could facilitate executing many of the recommendations that we've made here. And now Viva will talk about some of our community engagement recommendations.
So our next overarching theme is community engagement. We believe, obviously, that the key to identifying and reducing risk factors contributing to gun violence here in our West Baltimore community is the collaborative engagement between UMB and community members, UMB and our neighbors. Our approach to providing these recommendations occurs through three community mechanisms. One would be communication, our second is service, and our last is partnership, each of which I will get into. As Jess mentioned just now, we learned about the Carnegie Community Engagement classification, which recognizes academic institutions that have made a commitment to deepen the practice of service and further strengthen bonds between campus and community. We believe that implementing some of these recommendations about community engagement would support UMB's application for this important classification. So in terms of communication, we know that the Community Engagement Center, which is here in West Baltimore, which grew out of past President's Fellows white paper work, tirelessly works to provide for our local community. In order to better communicate the community needs, the CEC has put together an ad hoc community advisory board in the last few years to solicit information, to understand what it is that the community needs. We recommend that UMB institutionalize a formal community advisory board, engaging community members, researchers, clinicians, university administration, and law enforcement in regular discourse. We hope that this group can develop a strategic plan for addressing gun violence in our community. In line with this recommendation, we also believe that UMB can do more to better listen to our neighbors and respond to our community's most pressing issues and needs. This can be addressed by an annual open forum conducted by a professional mediator. This will be a safe space for everyone to be able to discuss implicit biases, social injustices, power differential, and racial concerns. And this type of regularly conducted public communication will allow UMB to hear directly from community members and community members to feel like they're being heard, and for our neighbors on how the campus can be a better partner. Another mechanism by which our community, we can support community engagement is through service. To foster a spirit of connectedness and interdependence with our neighbors. There are many academic programs here at UMB that include a community service and or service learning requirement for the students to graduate. A notable exception is the School of Dentistry. As you can see, a lot of them are wearing their uniforms today, and they have come to talks throughout the year, and they're very distinguishable by their presence. And a vast majority of the students at the School of Dentistry voluntarily participate in community service. They put countless hours of their personal time to give back to our community. These students have had the opportunity to be recognized by the School of Dentistry, and we fellows thought that this would be great if it could be enacted campus-wide, and suggest creating a university-wide award recognizing students who have dedicated their educational careers to community service. Currently, for UMB employees, they are entitled to up to 4 paid hours to participate in community service each year. In order to engage more faculty and staff in this program and in this effort, we propose increasing the number of paid hours to 1 full workday, or 8 hours, for employees, while also increasing awareness of the opportunity among staff and administration to participate in community work. And we do recognize that UMB does have a Public Servant of the Year award and an MLK Diversity Award here for a UMB community member contributing to diversity, inclusion, and equity. In addition to this, we believe it would fall in line then to establish a funded award for members of the UMB community who are actively doing work in violence reduction and or prevention. And in order to understand and kind of break down the barriers of silos, we think that it would be beneficial for the UMB community or UMB administration to designate a community affairs liaison at each specific school to coordinate and keep track of the community service activities that are happening in the community, of which there are a multitude. There are several programs through the different schools addressing similar needs in the community, and having a paid position on staff at each school can help coordinate some of these different opportunities. Of note, as we've mentioned before, the School of Social Work Community Outreach Service, or SWACOS, run by Dr. Wendy Shia at the School of Social Work, has already created a web-based platform to geographically mark community service activities occurring in the community. And we believe it would be beneficial to support and provide more resources to launch this web-based platform that already exists. And to bring all of these ideas together, we propose hosting an annual campus-wide community service event. As a member of the School of Medicine community, I know that we have a school-wide community service event at the beginning of each academic year, and it would be wonderful to see this on a campus-wide level. And finally, the last mechanism that I'm going to discuss today is community partnerships. There are so many community organizations that are working to reduce gun violence in our community today, and we see so many familiar faces that we've talked to throughout our time here as President's Fellows. They are attempting to reduce gun violence and address the social determinants of health that are contributing to violence here in our Baltimore City community. Their dedication to service deserves further recognition and support from UMB. So first we have the Social Work Community Outreach Service, which I've continually mentioned throughout our presentation today. And it is an independently funded nonprofit organization dedicated to creating transformative relationships through university and community partnerships from an anti-racist, anti-oppressive lens. SWACOS prides itself on fostering inclusivity among its partner community programs and empower members of the community to achieve a better future for themselves. Given SWACOS's transformative community work persisting in the presence of adverse situations that addresses the root causes of gun violence, we suggest that UMB invest additional resources in SWACOS to make their programs more campus-wide and allow other students to be able to participate in it as well. Another phenomenal program that we have shown here is the Violence Prevention Program, which is a highly effective, evidence-based program that grew out of partnerships between the University of Maryland Medical System and faculty at our School of Medicine. It was created by Dr. Carnell Cooper and addresses violence recidivism, or repeat violent offenders. This program provides victims with intensive case management to meet the needs of these individuals, reduce their activity in violent crime, and readmittance to the hospital. This has such a direct effect on individuals who may be victims of violent crime due to gun violence. And we propose that UMB evaluate the partnership with the Violence Prevention Program and identify effective supportive strategies to bolster the work that they are already doing in the Shock Trauma Center. And as many of you may have seen here in Baltimore City, Safe Streets. Safe Streets is a city-supported, privately funded community organization that uses the Chicago-based Cure Violence model to reduce shootings in high-violence neighborhoods. Here in Baltimore, there are currently 4 Safe Streets locations, each with its own staff outreach workers who act as violence interrupters in their neighborhoods. Safe Streets has demonstrated reduction in homicides and non-fatal shootings, affecting positive change in the attitudes towards guns and shooting among young people living in and around the communities where Safe Streets operates. During our interview, it was mentioned that Safe Streets had approached the school to aid in opening a site in the Poppleton community right across MLK, although it was ultimately decided that UMB was not equipped to do so. We fellows urge UMB to revisit this idea of sponsoring a Safe Streets location in our community in close conversation with local community members. We propose that we could possibly aid in supporting professional development and credentialing violence interrupters and provide a safer environment for everyone that interacts in our community. And lastly, we have THREAD. For the past 15 years, THREAD has created a large, family-oriented network of volunteers from across Baltimore City, working closely with the Baltimore City public school system to support high school students facing significant socioeconomic and subsequent academic challenges. Once a student is enrolled in their 9th grade year, THREAD has the ability to follow them for 10 years. THREAD has the goal of involving at least 5% of the local adult population in support for mentoring youth. And we should help them reach this goal. We propose increasing support of THREAD by providing physical spaces for students to interact in, physical space for mentors to interact with the students, as well as for events, and possibly increase the number of volunteers from UMB. As we know now, the School of Medicine does support THREAD and has added 10 new volunteers every year in support of this organization, and we encourage and urge this to just increase in the future. And now I'll pass it on to Zach.
So anybody who has access to a television knows that there's a lot of problems going on in the legal academy about what we can do to reduce gun violence in the country. Some of the ideas that have been thrown around include ease of access to firearms, universal background checks, strict record-keeping laws for retailers, registration and permitting, firearm carrier testing, and licensing provisions, just to name a few. So there's also a pretty large consensus that this is a public health issue, making it within the direct scope of UMB's purview. There is an underutilized office on this campus called the Office of Governmental Affairs. They were created initially to serve as a liaison between the campus and our elected officials at the city, state, and federal level. Our urge is simple. We want to see some of the commonly agreed upon policies that would mitigate the effects of gun violence advocated for by OGA to the city, to the Maryland General Assembly, to our congressional leaders, as well as to other elected officials. Another big concern we were discussing with some of our conversations was oriented around the Baltimore Police Department. Many Baltimoreans are apprehensive to call upon their help out of fear of escalation and exacerbation. The Department of Justice very recently entered a consent decree with the Baltimore Police Department. A consent decree is a court-enforceable order concerning First, Fourth, and 14th Amendment violations. It orders the parties involved to behave and conduct themselves in certain ways. All consent decrees have public engagement mechanisms where people can become involved in the court order itself and become agents of the court. The mechanism in this consent decree is the Baltimore Police Monitoring Team. We propose that OGA should be more involved on this team, should be an active and consistent and respectful member of being part of this conversation and making sure that the consent decree is fully realized on behalf of the DOJ and as well as Baltimore Police Department. On the other side of that coin is UMB Campus Police. In our conversations, the community has expressed a comparative comfort with campus police and with Baltimore Police Department. Some suggesting that we even expand UMB's policing jurisdiction. I think this comfort comes from this community enforcement model, this community policing model that UMB employs compared to Baltimore Police, where Baltimore Police Department may be concerned about the protection of individuals in terms of incarceration. Campus police is more of a priority on making sure that people who are investigated get the help they need. Expanding the jurisdiction would take a lot of weight off of BPD's shoulders, and we advocate for this stance with extreme caution. There has to be a lot of sensitivity to the communities that would be affected by this jurisdictional expansion, and their collaboration would be fundamentally necessary if this idea were to succeed. Without their input, it could backfire and not only detract from a lot of efforts that are already going on campus, it would also ruin the momentum of these existing kind of projects, but would also take us a step backwards, and it would force us to kind of rebuild our relationship with the community. So it's something that we do advocate for, but with extreme caution, and there needs to be a great sensitivity to the communities that would be within the new expansion of the UMB jurisdiction. So those are our advocacy recommendations. Those are our four kind of buckets of recommendations that they all fall into. You'll notice that they take an expansive view. We start on a very small level with our campus climate, seeking to remedy some of the problems that exist on campus, and then ultimately trying to build capacity not only on our community but our neighbors so that we can engage them in healthy ways and lead to productive conversations. Another thing that we were predominantly concerned with was the recognition that our four buckets only touch on gun violence tangentially. What we kind of have responded to with that is gun violence is a very downstream consequence of fundamental upstream problems. And some of these obviously have direct impacts, immediately impacting gun violence, a lot of our community engagement things as well as some of the advocacy things. But in order to get a holistic understanding of the causes of gun violence, we have to take a step back and address these upstream problems. So there are some people we would like to thank for these conclusions and all the help here. Dr. Jay Perman, Dr. Patty Alvarez, Dr. Kathleen Tracy, Mr. Gregory Brightbill, Ms. Courtney Jones-Carney, Ms. Angela Jackson, and Mr. James Wright. If we could please give them a round of applause. They have been tremendous in helping us with this project. So that concludes our presentation. We are now going to open up the floor for some actual conversation. We would like to solicit questions from our audience and hopefully clarifying and pointing out some things that are going on in our white paper.
So with the continuing efforts, I love all the recommendations what you have made, including the strategic planning. That is the biggest thing. And also mentoring is definitely something I would recommend going forward. But what is that you would ask the management for the accountability? Yes, you have made all these things right. So what are your next steps? Like how would you engage the University of Maryland management to get involved at the same level what you have put in the work. So what is that looking like?
Thanks for your question. I think the first step is to realize that we have so many people who are part of UMB that are already extremely engaged in these issues. And many of them are in the room. Some of them we mentioned in our presentation. Some of them we didn't mention verbally, but we've written about in the paper. So I think the biggest thing that we can do is try to bring all of those folks who are spread out a bit really together. And that's what we hope some of our recommendations have been rather concrete about. So that's what I would say.
But in addition to like writing outstanding white papers on the topic, what are opportunities that students can take advantage of as next steps to shift campus in addressing this issue?
I think this is like an important opportunity to recognize the upstream approach in terms of, and I speak on this because I talked a lot about community engagement and getting students involved in community service. I think this is the perfect opportunity to take some time and explore the different community service opportunities that are currently occurring here at UMB and getting yourself involved. I mean, I think part of recognizing the problem is familiarizing yourself with it and understanding what are the social inequities that affect our neighbors. So I think for students specifically, I know with the limited time in grad school that we do have, I think there is a little bit of time on the weekends and the evenings to tutor, to mentor, to become a part of some of these programs that exist, whether it's Merit, which is run out of Hopkins but supports high school students interested in STEM, or Thread, which supports a family network or Cure, which occurs here on campus. I mean, I think there's so many opportunities here on campus that students can get involved in, and that's immediate. It doesn't require any transportation, going anywhere. You're already here, you're already working. Why not do something that can be mutually, you can learn, but also you can help someone.
Tremendous gratitude for all of the effort and the thought and the outcome. I was sitting here, of course, listening intently, as you would expect me to do. I'm happy to say that it's not going to be hard to consider these recommendations because some of them I think we have a start on. Somebody mentioned, for example, research which does not take advantage of the community. And of course, in healthcare, we have a bad history in that regard. I think of the efforts centered in the School of Pharmacy, the CORI program, which involves community members in the design, the conduct, the reporting, and the dissemination of results. That doesn't cure the entire issue, but I think about that. I'm happy to say that a number of your recommendations, and we didn't know they were going to be your recommendations, are already being considered. So I think in answer to your question and taking responsibility for the institution, I can tell you that these recommendations, these thoughts are going to be given significant consideration. There are some things we can do. There may be some things we can't do for a variety of reasons. So I would hate to overpromise, but I can promise consideration. And in conclusion, and I say this over and over, I come around to the orientations, and I have the nerve to say to incoming students who are paying for their experience here, I have the nerve to say to them, I expect you to leave this place better than the way you found it. And that's what these folks have done. So thank you very much.